We're grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home webinar, Battle for the Vote, Protecting Voting Rights in a Time of Pandemic and Racial Reckoning. For today's call, ADL's Vice President of Civil Rights, Steve Freeman, will be in conversation with a panel of experts to discuss what the election will look like, the best strategies to protect it, and how you can get involved. As Vice President of Civil Rights and Director of Legal Affairs, Steve Freeman provides direction and oversight for ADL's work on core civil rights equities, including countering anti-Semitism and hate, fighting bigotry and discrimination, safeguarding religious freedom and the separation of church and state, and promoting immigrant and refugee rights. Nancy Abudu is Deputy Legal Director for Voting Rights at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She leads a team of experts dedicated to ensuring the voting rights of minority communities and other politically vulnerable populations, primarily in the Deep South. She was previously the legal director for the ACLU of Florida. Kim Wyman is the Secretary of State for Washington, and she is also co-chair of the National Voter Registration Day Committee and co-chair of the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Project. Wyman is only the second female Secretary of State in Washington's history. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn the call over to Steve.
Thanks, Deb. Hello, and welcome to everyone who is joining us. I would like to open today by acknowledging the huge loss our nation suffered this past weekend with the passing of John Lewis. We could ill afford to lose such a powerful and inspiring moral voice at any time, but especially in these perilous times. While he may no longer be with us, John Lewis's legacy is enduring, and it is especially true regarding the issue we are here to discuss today, one of the most fundamental rights in any democracy, the right to vote. Against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, and at a time of racial reckoning, this program focusing on protecting and securing voting rights is especially timely and important. Based on some of what we have already seen in 2020, the decision many voters are likely to face, whether or not to wait in crowded lines and rooms to vote, means assessing the risks of jeopardizing their health and the health of their loved ones. And this is especially true for members of marginalized communities who are most likely to contract and die from the coronavirus. We have heard in previous Fighting Hate from Home programs and from Black leaders in many other spaces that the most effective way ADL can lean in to the current fight for racial justice is by supporting efforts to ensure equal access to the ballot this year. We believe that at this critical time in our nation's history, it is imperative for this year's elections to be fairly held and for the ballot box to be made accessible to all eligible voters. To be clear, ADL's engagement on voting rights is on behalf of every voter, regardless of their political leaning or party affiliation. We are strictly nonpartisan, and we do not support or oppose any candidate for office. In today's program, our goal is to explore ways in which we can improve voter access while protecting voter safety. We will touch on questions regarding vote by mail, early voting, the availability of an adequate number of polling places and poll workers, and educational efforts in support of voter registration, and specifically the importance of National Voter Registration Day. We may also touch on concerns about misinformation and disinformation and about inappropriate appeals to bigotry and hate, which are of special concern to ADL. But primarily, we will focus on how we can do our part in homage to John Lewis to support voting rights as a critical building block in the creation of a more just and inclusive society. I've asked each of our two panelists to begin by briefly sharing their perspective on the current challenges we face to voting, what they are focusing their work on, and what they believe are the best ways to secure this fundamental right in America in 2020. After their brief opening remarks, I will ask them each a couple of questions to start a discussion, and we will leave time for a Q&A at the end. So let me turn now to Secretary Wyman for some brief opening remarks.
Well, yes, thank you so much for including me in this important discussion, and thank you all for the work that you do in this space. It is so important in this difficult time our country is going through, that every voice is heard and that our elections are conducted this fall in a way that empowers every eligible voter in this country to be able to vote safely and have their voices heard. So when I look at where our country is in elections right now, and I think back to what feels like 10 years ago, but December of last year, and when election officials were looking at this year for how we were going to plan our election, our biggest concern, quite frankly, was Russian interference. And we had spent the last 4 years moving towards how are we going to conduct an election that arguably is the most high profile and most what I'm going to say, most watched election of my lifetime, and how we were going to do that. And coronavirus hit and really changed everything we knew about how we were going to plan for this election cycle. But I think one of the things that I'm enlightened or optimistic, I should say, about the upcoming election is all of that preparedness for cybersecurity has connected election officials across the country in a way we weren't connected 4 years ago. And we're now using that as a way to spread information like how Washington does our vote by mail elections with other states and local jurisdictions, so they can start building in the accessibility that they're going to need to get voters' ballots, maybe so they can vote at home, maybe that they can vote safely in a polling place, whatever that is, to really enact those policies and procedures that are going to empower voters, but also address the criticisms coming from both sides on voter suppression and voter fraud, and make our elections accessible and secure. And that's happening across the country, and election officials are working very hard to ensure that their voters are going to be able to participate this fall. And or in primary elections, my state is right in the middle of a voting period right now for our primary election. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and answering questions and giving Washington's perspective on how we are ensuring that every one of our residents in this state are able to participate in this election, and I look forward to the discussion.
Oh, Steve, you're on mute.
Okay, I apologize for that. Let me turn next to Nancy Boodoo and ask for some opening thoughts from you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone at ADL who organized this panel. And Secretary Wyman, I haven't had the honor of meeting you in person, but it really is an honor to be on this panel with you, because I think one of the many things it demonstrates is that when it comes to nonprofit organizations and elected officials, we don't have to be on opposite sides of the aisle, of the table, or of the issue. We really can come together focused on a particular goal, even if our strategies are slightly different. So I'm really excited to hear some of the recommendations you have to share. In terms of the Southern Poverty Law Center, our voting rights practice group is relatively new. We opened up shop less than a year and a half ago, and the mission really was and continues to be to make sure that every person who is eligible to vote and everyone who should be eligible to vote is able to cast not only a ballot, but a ballot that actually counts. And so while that is a broad mission, it really encapsulates for us how we decide to do the work that we ultimately take on. And right now that falls into three primary categories. One, litigation, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk in a little bit more detail about the types of cases the SPLC and our partner organizations have filed. But for sure, for those of you who have been following the issue of felon disenfranchisement in Florida, the SPLC represents two women from Jacksonville, Florida, who, based on some recent appellate court decisions, are in serious danger of not being able to vote this August and November, despite the vote of over 5 million people in Florida to allow for automatic restoration of voting rights. We're also pursuing that issue in court in Mississippi as well. We're in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, trying to challenge what is really a permanent voting ban in Mississippi, where you have to actually get a bill, an individual suffrage bill passed in order for you as one person to be able to vote. So that's something we continue to challenge. Where we've also brought COVID-related litigation. I can tell you when we were putting our priorities together for 2020, COVID was not on the list. So it is an example of how we have had to shift resources and focus and energy in terms of dealing with the combined impact of voter suppression, a pandemic, and the real challenges that election administrators are facing. So how can we ensure safe elections in multiple manners so that people are able to exercise their right to vote in the way that makes the most sense and that promotes public safety. So we're continuing on with cases in that arena in Alabama, and we had a case in Louisiana as well that we hope to continue through a new filing. And then we've also filed amicus briefs. I saw in the chat someone asked about gerrymandering. We participated through an amicus brief in the Supreme Court's case, essentially refusing to create a legal standard through which partisan gerrymandering claims can be litigated. And what that has resulted in is a very scary terrain for us as we enter into the redistricting cycle next year. Regardless of how November's election comes out, I think it's clear that the redistricting process and the drawing of political lines is going to continue to be hotly contested, and perhaps the stakes will be even higher if we have an accurate census count that shows our shifting demographics, which necessitate a redrawing of some lines. And then in terms of some of the political or public education that we've been doing, SPLC recently launched an initiative called Vote Your Voice. It is focused primarily in the Deep South to make sure that communities that either have been low propensity in terms of voting or have faced other obstacles, including a lack of education, are able to not only register and vote, but that they're mobilized and educated around the issues and the candidates so that they are exercising an educated vote. And then finally, we've got a lot of legislative initiatives, but on the federal side, the main one is the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, known as Voting Rights Act, Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4. And for sure, this was an issue we've been working on, but with the passing of the legendary John Lewis and the fact that voting rights, as Steve said, has been one of his championed issues, we absolutely cannot let Congress go another session without really addressing and hopefully passing that bill. So with that, I'll stop there, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'm going to turn Secretary Wyman to you for a question. And again, start by saying we really admire the work you've been doing in Washington. I know your state has been a leader in voting by mail, and voting by mail sounds like an obvious solution to the pandemic, but we know there are many eligible voters who are either unwilling or physically challenged when it comes to voting that way. There are also serious concerns, I know in many other states, about being overwhelmed by the number of absentee ballots likely to be cast this year when they're not prepared for it. So how do we address concerns like that? What advice do you give to other states that don't have the benefit of your experience?
Well, we've been working really since the first part of the year when COVID was obviously going to impact the social nature of elections with our counterparts across the country. And so really trying to share those best practices that we've learned in Washington. But I can tell you the first thing that my election director, Gloria Gino, and myself felt when we started hearing states say, well, we'll just switch over to vote by mail, is we were really concerned because you have to do it well. And what I mean by that is you have to, first of all, figure out how you're going to go from 1 or 2% of your ballots returned by mail to 50 or 75%. And that's a heavy lift because as I think everyone on this call is aware, you have 50 different states who approach their voter registration list maintenance in 50 different ways. And so from just a basic mail out standpoint, do you have the most current addresses on file for the voters in your state, so you can actually get them a ballot on the first try? And I say that as a state that evolved to vote by mail over about a 20-year period of time. Back in 1993, when we started really ramping up our absentee ballots and we had voters choosing to vote by mail as a permanent absentee voter, when we started doing vote by mail elections, 10% of our ballots came back as undeliverable. Now, I know that there's a lot of partisan rhetoric that that's somehow a bad, fraudulent thing. It's a logistics thing. If we don't have your current address, we can't forward the ballot to your next address if it's not on file with the post office. So the first thing that has to happen is states really need to make sure that they have the most current addresses for their voters, regardless how many are going to receive them by mail. And so I think one of the things that all of the groups on this call that are represented on this call should be really actively doing is exactly what Nancy just mentioned. Make sure that you are touching your constituents, that's not the right term, but the people that you serve, to get them to update their address and register to vote. I think we put a lot of emphasis on registering, but make no mistake, a lot of times people move and they don't remember to update their address or change their name if they've gotten married or divorced or something. And all of these critical pieces are what become the administrative challenges as we get closer to Election Day. And if we really want to empower voters, we want to make sure we have accurate information. And that's something we can all do right now. It's a tangible action that can happen that really will empower those voters to receive a ballot by mail if they choose to. I think then the next level is the counties and the local jurisdictions that are processing these ballots, making sure they have the capacity and the throughput to be able to count them when they come back in and process them and give voters options for those returns. We have 500 ballot drop boxes here in Washington State on top of having prepaid postage return. So we give voters that option. Is it going to be easier for you to put it in a ballot drop box in your neighborhood or put it in a mailbox down the street? And I think, again, this goes to being in touch with those local communities and finding out what those challenges are that are preventing voters from engaging, because you're absolutely right when you say not every voter is going to be able to return a ballot by mail. We're anticipating between 1% and 2% of our voters will need to go into a voting center to use an accessible voting device or be issued a replacement ballot, even as a complete vote by mail state. And we have to be thinking now about that. How are we going to manage that so we don't have long lines on Election Day? So yes, I'm geeking out here, but yes, thank you for asking that question.
No, that's helpful information. I'm going to turn to Nancy with a question sort of the other side of the coin. We talk about the urgency of making sure people who want to go to the polls will be able to. And there's obviously concern about the number of available polling places this year and the fact that they've been reduced in many states and cities. Yet it's not surprising that many traditional polling places like schools may be unavailable this fall because of, or unable to accommodate adequate social distancing. So what do you think is the best way to address that challenge?
Well, first, again, vote by mail is not a panacea, but it's a great start. And so the first thing is to make sure that for those who are requesting their absentee ballots, let's try to make sure they get them. The overwhelming majority, or at least a significant number of people standing in line in Georgia during our June 9th primary have requested an absentee ballot and never got it. And so, of course, it was very inspirational to see them standing in a line literally for 4 to 5 hours. But at the same time, that was such a waste of time, so unnecessary. And again, for multiple reasons, a sign of lack of resources and adequate planning. And so I say number one, in terms of the polling place issue, let's try to limit or minimize the number of people who have to vote in person. For those who can avoid voting in person, yes, the polling place issue is a serious problem. During Georgia's primaries, we had over 80 or around 80 polling places that were closed, some precincts that were consolidated, and those individual precincts having thousands of people in some cases. So in one location, you had about 8,000 people over the course of the day standing in line to vote. So there needs to be something some proposals in terms of alternative spaces. Yes, schools, churches have been traditional polling places, but there are other government buildings that can be activated to provide that kind of resource. It's the same thing in terms of poll workers. I don't believe, and of course wouldn't advocate for age discrimination. If you can do the job, you should be able to do the job. But the reality is that COVID does present different health risks based on your age, based on your health history. And so for younger, healthier folks, there should be active recruitment for those individuals that will help these long lives move more quickly. So those are some initial things that come to mind in terms of alleviating the problem.
Let me go back to the Secretary with one more question for you, which is applicable to voting by mail or in-person voting, I think, and that is the reports we've been seeing and hearing about misinformation, disinformation, efforts to confuse voters about where they can vote, how they can vote. How concerned are you about that, and what measures are you recommending in your state to try to deal with that?
Well, you're tapping into all of the things that keep me up at night, and misinformation and disinformation 6 months ago I thought was our biggest hurdle, and it's just one of many now. We have to be really diligent in having trusted sources. And I can tell you that one of the things that we're working on at the national level with the state election directors and the Secretaries of State Association, as well as the election center with local election officials, is a program called Trusted Info 2020. And again, I know we would love to partner with the people that are representing groups on this call and organizations. Is we really want to be able to drive voters to places where they can trust the information that's coming to them, that they're going to their state or local election office and getting the information on the voting period and when the voting centers will be open and when they need to return their ballot. But it needs to come from someone that the individual voter trusts. And I am going to go out on a limb here and assume that the organizations that are represented on this call are trusted organizations in your local communities. So you are the best source of information. And so again, trying to use that network, we have a hashtag TrustedInfo2020, and we're really trying to push that out and connect with organizations like yours to share that information, because we know what's coming. We saw it in 2016. There were really good organized attempts from foreign actors to not only pit Americans against each other, but also get out information that made people think that they could text in their vote for a candidate. And when you look at it now in retrospect, the whole idea was to suppress voting blocks from voting. And so the best way to combat that is right now, get on people's radar that these are the trusted sources of information. So when you see that tweet or you get an email or text message that you aren't sure about, you can go to that trusted info source and get the information that they can count on. And I think that it's going to be a really important effort. And, let's face it, we're starting to see it right now already coming. Well, I don't want to get political, but we're already seeing it, and we have to combat it. And I think the best way to combat misinformation is with the experiences that we have in states like Washington. Let's talk about voter fraud. Let's talk about what happens on the ground and real, and then you just make that misinformation be less credible.
I think that it's great to know about that effort on Trusted Info 2020. It's something we would definitely be interested in helping support. Let me ask one more question to Nancy before we open it to Q&A, and it's a broader question from wearing my ADL hat and applies to you and other organizations too. What do you think are the best ways for organizations and individuals to engage on this issue and really have an impact?
So first, I would say, and this is just Nancy Abudu now, an analysis of your skill set. We love training people to be volunteers. But the reality is we literally have, about 100 days to the election. So we are really trying to drive people to work that they already can hit the ground kind of running. So if you are more of an activist, then phone banking and some kind of virtual canvassing is the thing to do. If you are a litigator, even if you are retired or nearing that stage, we could really use some help in terms of the emergency litigation that almost is certain certain to be necessary as we get closer to November, or even following some of the August elections that we had. And then I think the next thing that everybody can do, we all have the skills to do this, is to reach out to our elected officials and talk to them about why they need to pass better laws related to our National Voter Registration Act, why the funds that are directed towards our Help America Vote Act, for example, in terms of machines that actually work and don't cause further delays or long lines, that money is diverted or directed in that direction. So again, getting out there, hitting the streets virtually, litigating, helping us on that front, and for sure reaching out to our legislators for better policies.
Thank you. And I can say that this is an issue ADL is going to be devoting more time and energy to over the next 3-4 months. We're going to be creating some additional resources and trying to elevate the work that's already being, good work that's already being done by both of you and by others. And we're going to be inviting those who are listening today, and also our broader constituents to join us in that effort. Deb, I think let's open it up to some questions from our audience now, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you both, or thank you all three. That was really fantastic and certainly eye-opening, and the chat is just popping. So let's jump in. I'm going to try and group the questions a little bit to encompass a lot of the subjects that we're seeing come in. They certainly do fall into a lot of the same categories. So starting here, there's a lot of concern being expressed about people with limited internet access, or people with disabilities, the homeless, Native Americans, and all sorts of other groups for whom voting online or by mail may simply just not be a realistic option. What can we do to ensure that some of these communities have a fair and equal opportunity to vote this year? Either of you can really jump in on that, I think. So Nancy, why don't you go ahead? I'll put you on the spot.
Well, one solution that we actually proposed in our Alabama case related to the impact of COVID on voting is curbside voting, that there should be an opportunity for people not to even have to get outside of their cars or vehicles in order to drop off their ballots, and that there are definitely safe ways to do that. Drop boxes, like a mailbox, those are other options in centrally located, secure places where you, just as you drop your mail, you can drop your ballot with the confidence that it will be protected and delivered to where it needs to go. So those are two potential solutions that we are advocating for right now because they are doable.
Yes, I would just echo what Nancy said, and I know the work that some of our local election officials have done and our office has done is reaching out to those communities that might have challenges to find, again, a solution that works for their community. An example of that would be we have 29 tribes in Washington state, and each tribal nation has its own set of challenges, and I think that you solve them best when you work with the local officials. We have the Yakima Nation, where you have addressing challenges. They don't have traditional addresses to receive a ballot, let alone maybe even a mailbox. So we have used geocoding to precinct them in the right place. And then we've worked with the tribal leaders so that they can receive their ballots at the community center physically and put a drop box there. And that's an example of a local partnership with the county election office that really has empowered those voters to have their voices heard. And I think we need to be working with that along with all of the other things we're trying to accomplish by November.
Thank you. The great answers, both of you. So here's another one. What do you think are the best ways to counter the narrative around the argument that there's elevated voter fraud within mail-in voting? How do we counter that? So Kim, why don't we start with you on that?
I'll take that one because I've had that once or twice in the last few months. I think that you counter it with the facts. And so I've been asked by many news outlets about the president's tweets in particular. And I like to be very bipartisan. So I will say that I'll start with voter fraud, and I'll touch a little bit on voter suppression as well. Our experience here in Washington state is that we do have some very minor incidences of voter fraud. I don't want to just to downplay them, but I'll give you perspective. In 2018, we looked at voter history of our voters and compared it to 30 states who are part of the ERIC project, where we do data matching and maintain our roles with a whole lot of safeguards. And we found 142 cases of people who either voted more than once or voted on behalf of a deceased family member. Now that's a big number for some people, but that's in context of 3.2 million ballots counted. Or cast. So it's unacceptable. Any level of fraud is unacceptable. But with that said, it's 0.04%. And, so we are prosecuting those cases. We're moving forward with that and investigating. And that's how the system should work. We want to prevent it, but if it happens and we detect it, we're going to prosecute it. Now, to be bipartisan, I will say that on the other side, we are hearing about voter suppression. And I think you have to address both of those with facts. And if we're seeing voter suppression or things, Nancy, I thought, brought up some very good points about activities that could suppress voting blocks, and we have to address them, and we have to take each of these challenges very seriously. What I worry about is that both sides are weaponizing this in a political environment. We're seeing it certainly out of the White House and the Attorney General making wild claims that there's rampant voter fraud and there's going to be a rigged election. We're seeing on some members of Congress who have talked about, if we don't have absolute universal vote by mail, that we're going to suppress voters across the country. And I think that you have to legitimize the concerns and address them, but it's not a binary choice. Each state is going to have to come up with some hybrid solution that meets their voters' needs and does deal with voter suppression and does answer the claims. I didn't mean to make a face there. The claims of voter fraud in a way that neutralizes them. And at the end of the day, election officials have to inspire confidence in the harshest critics from the left and the right that our election was accessible and secure and that it was accurate and safe. And that's the bar that we all have to meet as election administrators, and we need to be working with groups that are bringing up and raising these concerns and be respectful of both sides, but also address them with the facts and call it out when those claims are overblown.
Well said. Nancy, would you like to add something, or should we go to the next question?
Not much to add. I agree with everything. We've got to stick to the facts. As tempting as it is to go low, we've got to stick with the facts, and we've got to call out the hypocrisy. If you vote by mail regularly and then you turn around and say it's a form of voting that can't be trusted, that's hypocritical. And so I think that we need to expose those hypocritical statements when they're being made and then continue to pound them with the facts.
Facts, facts, facts. I think that's exactly right. Thank you both for that. So here's another, and we've seen a lot of questions around this same theme. So if many states adopt a no excuse absentee ballot for the first time, it's logical to assume that it's going to take longer to count the votes. How concerned are you about the possibility, and what can we be doing to better prepare for that?
Okay, I hate to keep going first, I apologize, but I'm going to go ahead and be the election wonk here a little bit. I'm very concerned. There's a lot that keeps me up at night. This is actually the thing that's moving into #1 spot. Because right now, we are all calm. We are all figuring out how we're going to do the jobs that we have to do, from advocacy to mobilizing voters to counting ballots. And it's easy to talk about these things in a rational environment. But I've been through close election races. We had the closest governor's race in the country's history in 2004. And I can tell you, when you get in that environment, just like the presidential election in 2000, no one is rational, no one is logical, everyone is emotional, and it's a different conversation. And so what I want to say as an election official who has overseen vote by mail elections for 20 years, that you're going to have very late results. In Washington state, we have about 4.5 million registered voters right now. I anticipate we'll be close to 5 million. I anticipate 80 to 90% of those voters are going to cast a ballot in November. Half of our ballots come in election week. I'm going to say that again because this is so important. Other states are going to see a similar trend. Half of the ballots will be cast election week. In our state, we have a postmark, which means as long as it's postmarked before or on election day, we can count that ballot. We see a third of our ballots come in on Wednesday with a valid postmark. So start doing the math just in our state. 2 million ballots cast, and a third of those come in Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of election week. We physically will not be able to give meaningful total results election night. And we are good at processing high volumes of absentee ballots. And I anticipate that we won't have our meaningful results until probably Friday or Monday after election day. Now, that's a state that's prepared for it. Now you look across the country as you move east, where you have states that have 1% to 2% of their ballots returned by mail on average in most elections. They don't have the infrastructure built out to be efficient in that processing. They may not even be able to open those absentee ballots until election day. This is setting them up to fail. You have to be looking at that capacity and throughput. How are you going to deal with half of the ballots returned by mail coming in during election week? So I think we need to start anticipating and preparing voters, and particularly the media, that we may not know who the president is going to be. And I don't want to say this to the group, but I will, until late November. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that there's any kind of tampering going on. That means election officials are doing their job and that they are trying to process ballots in an accurate way. And in that processing, we know, as I'm sitting here with 2 lawyers, we know there's going to be litigation. And my experience in both Gore v. Bush and Rossi Gregoire is that whenever the team starts to lose, the litigation and the arguments come, and we see it, and it goes both ways, because ultimately, when you get into that environment, it's about campaigns trying to make sure their candidate wins. And so we have to right now start setting expectations that when we're counting ballots, that it's normal, that counting ballots during that certification window, be it 10 days or 20 days, like in my state, that process needs to be transparent. It needs to be well observed and well shared, so we can inspire confidence that you're not doing anything nefarious, you're actually just doing the work.
Oh, thank you for that. Nancy, I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about what we can be doing to encourage voter registration and how we can be a little bit more effective along those lines. And then Kim, perhaps after that, you can speak a little bit about National Voter Registration Day, which I believe you co-chair. But Nancy, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So it's not unique in terms of how community organizations approach GOTV work, but for sure for the SPLC, we're trying to be a lot more intentional about connecting the dots and letting folks know that, and I believe, again, Congressman Lewis, that voting is just the start. It doesn't end there. And that's part of the mobilization that continues through and after Election Day. So I think that we have to make the political process meaningful to real life individuals and their daily lives. The president, of course, is an important elected official, plays a major role on the national level, but we're focused on school boards and city councils and county commissions, because those are actually the individuals you can go to on a Wednesday night and bend their ear for about an hour about all the things you'd like to see. And that is the kind of community engagement that we want to promote. So I would say, in terms of doing the GOTV work, we've got to make the connection as to what does a vote translate into? What are the concrete manifestations of why and how your vote counted?
Oh, Nancy, what you just said warms my heart so much, I can't even tell you. I have spent the better part of 25 years going and talking to young people in college and high school. And one of the first things that I do is an exercise where I really show, in hopefully a meaningful way, how their vote matters. Because we all most Americans vote every 4 years. We all know that. That's when you see the highest turnout. And most people get really riled up about the presidential election, but the people that affect their daily lives are those local school board members and city council members and mayors and fire commissioners. And yet those are the elections we have the lowest turnout in. And so I get on a soapbox all the time that if you really want to have an impact with your vote, you need to vote in every election. And it matters more in those elections than the presidential. So you just made my whole day. But National Voter Registration Day is coming up. It is September 22nd. I apologize because I had to look it up just to make sure I got the right date. But this is a nationwide effort, and it's a very exciting day for us in the elections community, because we see this great spike of people who are going online, particularly young people who may not even be familiar with the process and are connecting with their local election officials and getting registered to vote. And, you know, I really want to put on the emphasis again that it's not just registering, because when you just ask a person if you're registered, most people say, oh yeah, I'm registered, been registered a long time. They forget that they haven't updated that registration in a long time and the data is outdated. So really important one. And again, I know that many of the listeners on this call are actively involved in that process and are going to help us make that a successful day.
Thank you for that. I have to say that the most popular question that I've seen asked in easily a dozen different ways are, what can individuals be doing to make a difference? And how can they be helping? Do they volunteer to count votes? Are there websites that they should be going to? Steve, I know that ADL is doing a variety of things on this front, and we'll certainly include it in our follow-up email to all of you. But perhaps you could start us off by telling us a little bit more about some of the things that ADL has been involved in, and then the others, I would also love to hear from you about what folks can do to really feel like they're having a tangible impact. Steve?
So thanks, Deb. I actually am interested in hearing from the others that question particularly. We have been reaching out, and we're going to be working with groups like State Voices and like Election Protection and others who have been gathering information about campaigns in different states. In some states it is about mail-in voting. In some states it's going to be about helping or promoting early voting or same-day registration. There are different campaigns out there. We're creating some tools to make it, which will make it easy for people who are interested to come to our landing page on our website, which we're going to be developing, saying, here is where I live, here's what's happening in my state, here's how I can plug in and be helpful. It's all, we're basically not seeing ourselves as leading on this, but rather as elevating the voices of it. There are a lot of people who have been laboring this vineyard for a long time who are doing some really amazing work. Common Cause, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and others, and the ACLU. But we're looking for ways that we can really try to have an impact, try to encourage people to add their voices. And I think we're very fortunate to have with us both Kim and Nancy, who will have additional ideas for ways that we can encourage our folks who are interested to add value here.
Great, thanks, Steve. Nancy, what do you say?
Sure. Well, again, please check out SPLC's Vote Your Voice initiative. We are not only encouraging folks to volunteer with our grantees that do this kind of work on a daily basis, but SPLC is also launching internally for our members and other supporters some phone banking opportunities, especially because of the virtual canvassing world that we're in right now. And then, as Steve said, we partner with the usual suspects, Lawyers Committee, NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, but we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think for us at the SPLC, we're really encouraging more work in the rural areas. And we see in many places, for those, for example, who followed the Ahmaud Arbery case, that we can't turn our backs on the rural areas. People are still being victimized and suffering there. And it's not just police brutality. It does translate into voter suppression as well, which dictates why the criminal justice system is what it is in those communities. So we're trying to get outside of the metro areas like Atlanta, like Miami, and into the more rural communities where members, community residents don't often see volunteers. So, but we're trying to to do it in a respectful way, a collaborative way, and a way that isn't a parachuting mechanism, but one that comes with resources and tools and an investment so that the country can continue to thrive even if we're no longer on the ground.
Thank you for that. Oh, yes, Kim, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would just echo what Steve and Nancy have said. Those are the great places to start. And I would add three things. The first one is, remember with COVID, one of the unforeseen, or what do I want to say, the unexpected elements is that we've canceled all of these public gatherings we normally would have in a presidential year, county fairs and get-togethers, which are normal places for voter registration outreach, and they just don't exist. So I think the first thing is utilize any online practice you can to mobilize anyone that you can touch, and certainly use that amplification of social media to drive people to those voter registration sites that are online so that they can engage, and early is best. Second is, it makes me cringe a little that you're doing efforts to same day. I love same day because it's a great fail safe, but I would encourage, again, the groups that are on the line to be trying to get people to go and vote early, to register early, to do all of those things early, because there's a tendency for most of us to wait till the last minute. And that's what is very difficult for election officials to plan for. Like I said, we're planning for 1 to 2% of our voters to show up on Monday and Tuesday of Election Day. And those are crushing numbers for our counties to be planning. How do you manage the line of cars that are going to be people that are doing curbside pickup? And they're doing a great job of planning it, but you can't anticipate if it's an unknown number. So the earlier, the better, and early voting windows. And like our state has a 20-day voting window, make use of that and encourage your people to use it. Finally, this is the thing we haven't talked much about. COVID-19 has that very big impact on people who are over 65, and that is our election workforce, whether you are a polling place state or a vote by mail state. And so I would encourage everyone listening on this phone, check with your local county or township or whatever election officials, even your state officials, for opportunities for employment. We talk a lot about, and I think we think a lot about, volunteers for Election Day, and that poll site workers are volunteers. A lot of these are paid positions, and I can tell you this is a nationwide problem. We absolutely need to do a major recruitment effort, and I know many of us are working on that in multiple spaces, nonprofit, business community, college students, anyone we can reach out to in the vote by mail or absentee environment. That period of processing is not just Election Day. In my state, it happens 20 days before and another 20 days after Election Day. We need people to work, and many times these are well-paid positions. So please get that word out to reach out to your local election officials for employment opportunities, because all of you should be involved in that process as well.
Thank you for that. So another question. The role of the Supreme Court in voting rights is just so important. And many SCOTUS watchers have said, as Sotomayor did recently, that the court is engaged in a trend of condoning and facilitating disenfranchisement. Can you respond to that? Go ahead, Kim. Oh, you're on mute, but I can see that you want to get there.
You know, this is one of those areas that is, even though I'm a partisanly elected statewide official, in the day-to-day duties of my job, I really try to stay in the nonpartisan space, because I have to inspire confidence in the full electorate, the most liberal Democrat to the most conservative Republican, and every voter in between. So I've been in the executive branch a long time at the county level and the state level. And so, you know, I have to respect the role of the judiciary and the legislative branch and do, but, you know, as an election administrator, we have to follow the law. We have to follow case law. We have to follow our legislative, you know, the boundaries that our legislature sets up and that the federal, you know, Congress sets up for us. And with that said, we try not to weigh in, but, you know, certainly I can talk to how I administer things in my state, and it's following the law. And so I can't do a lot of advocacy in the area you're talking about, but yes, I mean, election officials get very concerned when when any of this process is politicized, and it can be politicized from legislative branch, and it can be politicized from the judicial branch. And I think we just try to occupy the space to make sure that we protect our voters.
Nancy?
Yeah, right now SCOTUS has my emotions going all over the place. I've had some great wins this year, only to be followed by the Supreme Court holding those favorable decisions in their tracks temporarily. But I try to remind myself that with each of the branches, any negative decision that comes out from any of them is not insurmountable. And that I really believe even applies to the US Supreme Court. This is where Congress needs to step in and say yes. During a pandemic, when you have people who are immune compromised or caring for people who are, they shouldn't be required to have to vote in person if there's another way for them to do it. If you have a decision out of Florida, like what we got in May, that says 1.2 million people should be able to vote, even those who owe financial obligations can't be denied because they're poor, and then the Supreme Court puts that on hold, that's problematic. And so I think what we are going to continue to do is battle these issues out in the courts, but we're also shining a light on some of these decisions to signal to Congress, you need to step in. And for those elected or political officials who have the discretion to do the right thing, even absent a court order, we're encouraging them to do that. Save your taxpayer dollars, save all of this attorney time, and just do the right thing for your constituents. So those are our immediate responses to some of the negative decisions we've recently gotten.
Thank you for that. Before I let you go, and thank you for what I think has been an extraordinary panel, and we've gotten all sorts of comments in the chat that echo that sentiment as well. There's also a lot of anxiety emanating from that chat. So Kim, I'm gonna ask you and then Nancy to give us one thing to be hopeful for as we look towards this election season.
I think where you can be hopeful is that one of the things I think is the strength of the American election system is the decentralization, and that it's not held by one elected official at the state level that gets to control everything, that it's those local clerks and auditors and election officials that actually operate our system. And they take an oath of office to uphold their state constitution and their constitutional laws in their state. And I say that because my experience with the election officials that I have worked with has been very much that they answer to their local voters and their constituents. They're acutely aware of it, and their job is to protect those voting rights of every one of those voters in their charge. And so I have faith in that, because those election officials, while even some of them are partisanly elected, never lose sight of the fact that democracy rests on their decisions and those policy decisions that they make in their offices, and they want to make sure that the people that are elected represent their voters, and in every sense of that word. So it gives me hope to know that those 10,000 elected officials and those people they oversee are going to carry that torch and make sure our elections are well run.
Thank you. Nancy, to you.
That our voices are getting louder and stronger, and that we're becoming more unified. Again, we might have different strategies, but our end goal is the same. And I'm really happy about the coalitions and other partnerships that are forming towards that end. And so that's what gives me hope. That's what keeps me going. And my clients, you know, these are the folks who are directly impacted by the laws we're challenging in court. And they're the ones that give us that extra energy to just keep on going, keep the battle going. And so that's where I find my strength during some tough times.
Well, thank you both for that. I have to say, I feel a little bit better. At least I have a few things to hold on to that provide a little bit of hope. Thank you so much for joining us today and for lending your voices to this conversation. I think it was just excellent. And for those of you who are asking, it was absolutely recorded, and we will absolutely be circulating some of the resources that were spoken about here today. We'll be sending out an email in the coming days. It has all of that there for you, so not to worry. And for everyone on the line, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today as we continue to fight hate from home, and invite you to join us again next time, and you'll get information about that in your inbox soon. Thanks so much, and be well.